Welcome back, Richard. Good morning. It's good to see you this morning.
Good morning. Happy Mother's Day, I guess.
You know, it is Mother's Day today. And we're going to kind of talk about mothers a little bit. Didn't think
Right.
about it until you just said Happy Mother's Day. But, you know, the last couple of podcasts, last week we did a two-parter
Hmm.
talking about, you know, the way regulation and how we respond to emotions and feelings that we get. And today we're going to kind of bridge that to maybe to something that people wouldn't necessarily think of as being related to that. And we're going to talk about spanking, and this may be a two-parter as well.
Right. People, when we talked about self-regulation or emotional regulation, we talked about it's a two-part process. In the first part, the first step is you have this emotional reaction. You have this feeling. Something in the environment produces a feeling. And we said the response is different. And people frequently say, well, what do I do? How do you know that these two things are separate, that,
Mhm.
a feeling is produced? Because to me, it feels like the feeling and the response are a single entity,
Right.
a single thing. And so what else can I do? How can I control that? Well, you control it at the reaction, at the response side. And people will simply say, well, what else can I do? Give me an example of what I can do to separate these two things and to come up with effective alternatives to that. And so spanking offers a good example. It's not the only example. It offers a good example of what you can do instead of spanking. Okay.
Right.
Well, how do I do this? And I think spanking is a good example of that.
Right. Yeah, because as we're going to talk about it, you know, your child does something, which is what is going to trigger an emotion or a feeling in the parent, and then the parent's going to respond in some way. Uh,
Right.
Spanking is one way, and you know, we live in not to be completely stereotypical, but we live in the South, and in the South, butt whoopings, spankings. Um, are very common here,
Papa's butt, right?
right?
And also biblical uh,
Reference.
admonitions of spare
Um,
the rod, spoil the child. We talked
right.
about that many times. But this process that we're talking about, this how do we contain our emotions? I think it comes down to how do we contain our response to our
Mhm.
emotion. You don't control your emotions, but you control your response to your emotions. Well, at least you can learn to control your emotions over time, but most of us are not very good at that because emotions are tied to our temperament and personality.
You know, as you were just saying that, you know, I don't know if you've seen this movie, but so this is going to kind of go back in the past. Remember the Matrix movies?
I have no, I haven't
That's
seen
why
it.
I prefaced it. So in the third um, Matrix movie, Neo, the Keanu Reeves character, goes and meets this guy called the Architect, and the Architect is the guy who basically is the program that developed the Matrix. Anyways, it's a great movie. Yeah, you should go see it. Uh, it can't even be a spoiler alert anymore because this movie's been out for I don't know, like 100 years or something.
I
But
have three people in my life telling me that I have to see The Matrix, and I finally found it, the first one. So,
okay. So, anyways, so he goes to see the architect, and when he meets the architect in this room, he is surrounded by like little TV screens.
uh-huh.
And what's fascinating is if you watch it, the architect will say something, and the TV screens, in a couple of clips in it, the TV screens show all the different reactions that Neo may have to that
Okay.
thing that whatever it is that the architect says. And that's what we're talking about. Like you can have you have your emotions, you know, he receives the information
Right.
and here's all the different options that he has to respond. Some of them
Mhm.
are lashing out in anger, some of them are fear, some of them are different, you know, different things. But he chooses which one that how he's going to respond. And that's sort of what we're talking about is that you have you can't help the information that you receive. You can't help the stimulus. If we talk about it in behavioral terms, you can't change that. You can't necessarily change the impulsive initial response that your body gives you,
Hmm. Hmm.
but the way that you manifest, the behavior that follows, that's what you have some control over, choice over.
That's right, because the feeling itself, let's be fair, it could be something pleasant.
Right.
If somebody comes up and hugs you, or there's a certain perfume that the sudden person walks by and wow, that produces a pleasant feeling.
Mhm.
Okay. Or it might be something odious. We all watch crime shows where they walk into the crime scene and the body's been there for a few days and everybody goes, "Boo," blah, blah.
I thought
And
you were going to say everybody has walked into a teenager's room and
that's right.
it's like, whoa.
Right. Or it could be dangerous and potentially life-threatening, like you hear screeching tires or a gunshot, and you react instinctively to that.
Right.
Okay. Something might be irritating, like a baby cry. If you've raised children, you all remember that time when the baby just couldn't be consoled and
Right.
she cried and cried and cried. Or you're listening to somebody else's music, or somebody's tapping on the table where you're trying to concentrate. So that could be an irritating stimulus, or just a disrespectful comment from an irritated teenager. If you've ever raised teens, every once in a while they get snarky and they'll say something that has a little edge to it,
Mhm.
and it produces this feeling inside you. So all of these feelings, some of them are instinctive responses, and they're supposed to be. Okay.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Some of those, as we've suggested, the stimulus and the response happen together because it's life threatening.
Life saving.
When
Exactly.
when you hear something dangerous, when you hear a gunshot, you're going to instinctively, it's like you don't even, that's not even a thoughtful behavior.
That's right.
Oftentimes when something, we're joking about the way that things smell, but oftentimes really bad odors, we respond instinctively to it because a really bad odor means something's wrong, something's bad, something's potentially dangerous, and so we
Right.
react to that.
Right.
So yeah, some of those things, yes, the feeling that we get and the behavior that follows do happen together, but it's more reflexive, more instinctive than it is decision making.
That's right. Because the way our nervous system is set up is that each of our five senses has that automatic instinctive response built into it.
Right.
So that whether it's hearing or vision or smell or taste, anything that triggers that life-threatening possibility, our brain is structured to get rid of it immediately or protect yourself immediately.
Right.
That's a different situation. That is an instinctive response that's life-saving. Okay.
And you can often tell that because the behavior is it's like that.
It-
It happens, but then it's over.
right.
It's not a drawn yes, sometimes something can happen and you reflexively respond with some force, some aggression, some pushing
Right.
away or something like that. Pushing something away for safety is very different than fighting someone, going at them and just keep hitting them over and over and over again.
Right.
That's very different. So the reflexive protect yourself and push somebody away is very different than being angry and fighting someone,
That's
so
right.
you can tell the difference sometimes that way.
And we're talking about that second type of
Right.
behavioral response. Okay. Um, because the second step in this process, for most of what we experience on a day-to-day basis is not life-threatening. I
Right.
mean, what's the last time you heard a gunshot and ducked, okay, or you heard screeching tires and jumped out of the way? Most of what we get are feelings that are produced, and we do have a choice as to how we're going to react to them. It may not feel that way. It may not feel that we're making a choice, but we argue that it is. And more importantly, if you want to do anything about it, and most of us do, that we have to teach ourselves and be responsible for what choices we make, how we respond to most things that go on in our environment.
Right.
And I think a newly minted teenager, the middle schoolers, okay,
Mhm.
sixth, seventh, and eighth graders, newly minted teenagers can be very difficult. And when they respond in a way, in a disrespectful way, it stings. It stings and makes us angry, but it's not life-threatening. I
Right.
mean, there's not going to be an instinctive response, okay? It's not life-threatening. Because it's not life-threatening, our limbic system, these structures deep in our brain, don't get activated, okay? Because it's not life-threatening, okay? So if it's not life-threatening, now we're in the area of choice. Now we start to say, yeah, I have some responsibility for my reaction.
Right. And what we know what many people say, they'll say that, well, I can't help my response, or, well, it just happens.
Mhm.
Right. We do condition ourselves to respond to certain things in certain ways. It's still a choice, but we sort of like Pavlovian, right? It wasn't that the dogs necessarily made the choice, and talking about dogs versus humans is very different because of decision making. But when a kid says something and you react, it's not life threatening, so it's not limbic, it's not instinctive like that. But that's something that is conditioned over time. And that's one of the things that makes it difficult to change that behavior. But it's still a behavior that you can change, a decision that you can make. You can say, when somebody talks to me that way, this is what I'm going to do.
Right.
It may be difficult, it may take a lot of work the first few times, but I can do that and get better at it over time. And I think it's that decision making, that intent, intent that we have to change that behavior that's so important, and something that most people or many people avoid. They just don't
Right.
want to, they don't want to do that work.
Right. When I first proposed this notion to people, many people initially reject it, and they say, no, no, no. When I get triggered like that, there's an immediate response, and I get angry, or I'll slap her in the face, or I'll take her phone, or I'll do something because that behavior makes me do this. No, that's the difference, is that that feeling that you have, if it's not life-threatening, then the feeling that you have produces some kind of a response. And that response, though you may not choose it at the moment, it ultimately is a choice. It's a choice in the sense that you must have control of how you react to all these other events that occur to you on a daily basis.
And here's how you can tell that it's a choice. Um, we use the example of gunshots, and we do hope that most people do not have daily occurrences of hearing a gunshot and have to duck. We
Sure. Yeah.
That's in people's lives, but um, every time if you're outside and you hear a gunshot, just about every time we could say that you're probably going to respond to that in a pretty similar way. You're going to duck,
Right.
you're going to jump down on the ground, you're going to run for the house or something.
Right.
But when you're talking about these other behaviors, things that teenagers say or things that teenagers do, the way that you know that it's a voluntary behavior is because you don't always respond exactly the same way.
Right.
If
Right.
every time your teenager said you were, called you a name, said you're stupid, um, you don't respond the same way every time, because sometimes they're joking. Sometimes it's part of a game that you're playing. Sometimes they're angry and they're saying it. So the context changes the way that you respond to it. And because of that, we know it's not life-threatening. We know it's not instinctive. And so you're making a decision. You're using contextual cues, and you're responding in a way that fits based upon the way that you're seeing it in a contextual manner. So if you're doing that, then there is some decision making, and you can change that behavior.
Another good example is go back to the teenager comment or the child, any child who responds disrespectfully to a parent. If it's just you and the child alone at home, you might react one way.
Right.
But if it happens in a crowded room, you might say, oh, I can't slap her here because I'll get in trouble. That's what I mean by a choice.
Right.
In a different context, that context will determine how you respond to that. Same behavior, same feeling, very different response.
Absolutely.
Okay. I learned this. I was a teacher. I taught middle school for some years. And I thought, wow, I wouldn't be allowed to talk to my students the way I talk to my children
Right.
because I couldn't get away because they'd go home and tell their parents that I
Right.
something. And so it's the same feeling. A student and your own child can produce exactly the same feeling, but your response is going to be very different. And I like what you said about if you hear a gunshot, it's an instinctive reaction and it is always the same.
Right.
You're going to duck and cover. So that's what we mean by we believe that you are in control of your response. And there are um, many examples of that. Okay. So this notion that we have has important implications. This notion that feelings and responses are distinct, they're related but distinct, has important implications for how we raise our children, how we relate to our partners, even how we respond to other drivers. I mean, we all get angry with other drivers periodically, but our response has to be measured. Our response has to be ours. It has to be under our control. Okay. And what is it about spanking?
Yeah. And
Well,
and spanking is always such a touchy topic
right.
because there are some people who have a fundamental, almost fundamental belief in spanking.
Mhm.
I'm not exactly sure where that comes from. And again, I don't know if it's just because of the region, the area that we're from or that I'm from. I've lived here my whole life. Um,
Right.
but, I always think back to that. We were going to do a present. This is a number of years ago. We were going to do a presentation for our book at a church. And remember the message that we got from the woman that we had contact with was, "No, you're not going to tell people that they can't spank their kids, are you?" And she just came out and said it like that, and it I know it caught me off guard, and I said, well, not exactly, but we're going to talk about that there's probably a lot of other ways that you can manage your kids without having to spank them, but it is something that's sort of built into some cultures, and because of that, I think it's really important to think about how the way that you were raised and the experiences you had as a child is going to inform the way that you see spanking. And so a lot of people will see spanking, swatting a child on the backside, or you see that as a reflexive, as an impulsive, as a natural reaction that you don't have decision about. Because they happen in the heat of the moment, they happen without really thinking about what's coming next or anything like that. But it is a decision that you make. It is a choice because you're choosing to respond in that way. It's based upon context again. It's based upon your past experience, but it is something that you can change.
And what we typically hear is, well, I
Hmm.
have to spank my children. Otherwise, my child will be disrespectful, or they will be disobedient, or they will do things that I don't want them to do, or they will impose themselves on other people, or they will impose on me. So I have to teach them manners. I have to teach them respect. I have to teach. We don't disagree. All we're saying is there are other ways to do that that are
Right.
just, we don't disagree with your goal. Your goal is absolutely right. I think too many kids are out of control today. Too many kids are misbehaving in schools, in homes, in public places. So I don't disagree with your goal. All we're suggesting is there are other ways to accomplish the same goal that I think would be in your benefit and in your child's benefit.
Right. Because when you ask this question, it changes the story. When you say, yes, okay, so they say I have to spank because that's the only way to tell him how serious it is that he needs to stop that behavior. As soon as you ask, well, how many times have you had to spank them because of that behavior? They say, well, I have to
Right.
spank them all the time, every day, just about. So clearly, spanking isn't working.
Right.
If you have to do it more than once, that means that spanking isn't demonstrating or doing the thing that you're hoping or feeling like it's doing. Yes, it may stop the behavior in that immediate moment, but it's not going
Hmm.
to stop it from happening again in the future. And it certainly isn't going to stop it from happening when you're not there.
Right. And the other thing to remember is that when you spank, if you spank hard enough to make an impression,
Mm.
to feel some pain, is another way of putting it. If you spank a child hard enough to make an impression, you you're telling the child, if you do that, the child begins to associate a behavior with pain.
Mhm.
Okay. That's called learning. I mean, that's a way to learn something. But you're not teaching them what else they can do.
Right,
And that's what's missing with spanking is there's a learning experience because the child is associating um, pain with a certain behavior.
right.
That's learning, but it's really not learning that they can use because they don't know anything else. You haven't taught them anything else. You haven't taught them what else they can do in these
Right.
circumstances.
Right. So let's think about some reasons for the rest of this podcast. Let's talk about some reasons to avoid spanking. And I think that the first thing is that typically speaking, spanking is done, physical punishment occurs when both the child and the parent are in a heightened emotional state,
Right.
right? This is often what leads, we'll just say typical corporal punishment, routine spanking. It's what can put you at risk for that turning into physical abuse.
Right.
Because once you're in an emotional state and the child's in an emotional state, now you're at risk for doing more harm than you intend because
Mhm.
you're heightened and they're heightened. And so they're moving and squirming and you're trying to do what you're trying to do. And you might spank in the wrong spot of their body. You may miss their bottom and hit the back of their leg, put a mark on their leg. And now we're talking about risk for things to be considered abuse. And so because it happens in that heightened emotional state, as you just said, certainly at that time, no learning is happening.
Right.
Nobody's learning, okay, so when I do that, I can do this instead. I should change this behavior, or I should not, roll my eyes when my mom asks me to do something. Those connections aren't being made. That learning isn't being made. All that's being made is this hurts.
Right. That's right. And that's, again, you can argue that that's learning. I'm going to hurt you. If you do this, I'm going to hurt you. So you've learned that. But you haven't learned anything else. And that's the problem. When we're raising grandchildren right now, and it would be unthinkable. Right? My granddaughter's a year old, 13 or 14 months old, and it would be unthinkable to spank her or to hit this little thing hard enough to make an impression. And so there have to be other ways to accomplish the same goals. There are many things we don't want her to do. I don't want her to stick her fingers in the light socket. I don't want her to fall over in the bathtub. I don't. There's 100 things I don't want to have happen to her. But I've got to teach her these things, not just punish her. The other thing that happens when we talk about spanking is that, well, if that didn't work, maybe I have to hit her a little bit harder, or maybe I have to hit her more times, and instead of hitting her twice on the butt, maybe I got to hit her 5 times on the butt. We frequently hear people say that. Well, you got to hit her harder so it makes an impression.
Mhm.
That's bad advice. I mean, it obviously isn't working, so we have to come up with alternatives.
Right.
Okay.
The other
Um,
another thing, another problem or reason to avoid spanking is because spanking focuses on the negative behavior.
right.
Spanking says this is what we're paying attention to. And we've met with a lot of parents and a lot of families, and oftentimes the bad behavior is the behavior that always gets the attention. And many times, the research is pretty clear that, when you pay more attention to the positive behaviors, the things that you want them to do, and we're certainly not talking about, giving kids rewards and all these
Mhm.
tokens and all this kind of stuff just because they did what they're supposed to do.
Right.
But Richard, how powerful is it to simply say, you know what, thank you for picking up your room today, or thank you for putting your shoes where they go. I really appreciate, I didn't trip over them when I walked in this morning, walked in this evening when I got home from work, and I really appreciate you doing that.
Right.
Like that is not, all it is words, but it can mean so much to a kid that they're going to be more likely to put their shoes in the right place the next day.
If they know what you want them to do and you're acknowledging it, there's a greater likelihood that they will do it. Will they still make mistakes? Absolutely. Will they still get frustrated? Absolutely. But that's where the teaching comes in,
Right.
right? So, so you're right. Let's focus on what we want them to do, not, and many parents are they're acutely aware of what they don't want their children to do, and they spend a lot of time catching kids being bad. And we're saying, let's reverse that. Let's catch them being good.
And what's fascinating is a lot of times when you ask parents and or kids, well, I'm not supposed to do this, or I'm not supposed to do that, or they don't want me to be on my iPad. And I'll say, what do they want you to do instead?
I know.
Kids look at you blank. Parents, they'll say, well, he's not going to spend all this time on his, video games. He's not going to sit in there on his video games for hours and hours. He needs to find something else to do. I said, okay, well, what else would you like him to do?
Hmm.
Well, no, I don't know. He just needs to find something. Okay, sure. Kids need to be able to find themselves, make themselves occupy themselves, deal with the issue of boredom. We've talked about that before. But
Right.
um, but at the same time, he's not allowed to play video games. He's not allowed to look at, videos or use electronics. Okay. He's not, you don't want him going, he can't just bother other people. He can't do this. He can't. Now you're limiting all these other things that he can do. Um, and I'm sorry, but your 12-year-old isn't going to spend 3 hours reading in the afternoon.
Right.
Um, some kids will, but most kids won't.
That-
So yeah, it's you have to give them the other thing. You have to make other opportunities available for them to do.
That's right. You take the average 8, 9, 10-year-old boy, particularly boys, who plays Minecraft 5 hours a day. If you take that away, I'd wager that that child eventually will find something else to do. But the time between shutting off Minecraft and finding alternatives is going to be a very difficult. It's going
Yeah,
to be a very difficult time period because this child's going to be a nuisance.
right,
He's going to be whining and complaining and begging and pleading and threatening to get back to the thing he likes the most. So be careful. You're right. If you're going to take it away, say, and instead we're going to do these things during that time.
right.
Okay. Now the
And you can
child.
set all that stuff up ahead of time.
Exactly.
When you're not playing Minecraft, here's a menu of things that you could do instead.
Right. That's right.
And but that is teaching,
That's teaching.
not punishing them. That's
Right.
teaching.
Right. And that's I think the last thing we want to say about spanking is that when you spank, you're modeling.
Right,
When a child goes to school, you can't touch other kids. You can't, even in any way, you can't even be affectionate in classrooms today,
yeah,
let alone be physically aggressive in a classroom. If a kid hits other students, if a kid comes to kindergarten or first grade and is hitting other students, that kid's going to have a very rough time.
right,
What are you modeling when you spank or hit? I mean, we're talking about spanking. God help you if you're slapping kids on other parts of their body. And so you're modeling a behavior. If you're bigger, it's okay to hit somebody. If you're stronger, if this is how if you have a problem with somebody, it's okay to hit them. That's what you're modeling. Spanking models what you probably don't want your children to learn.
right.
Okay.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's. I think we're going to wrap up there today.
Right.
In the next podcast, we're going to talk about some alternatives to spanking. Again, other things that you can do, other things that you can choose to do when your
Right.
child is behaving in a way that you want them, you don't want them to behave. Other things you can do besides spanking that will, teach them the behaviors that you're wanting, but also get the message across that that behavior isn't appropriate. So we're gonna focus on alternatives to spanking in the next podcast.
Right.
All right. Until then, stay happy, stay healthy. and forget to be afraid.